Ladies and gentlemen, I guess it's time to start, so we'll get going on the panel. This is the welcome to everyone to the panel on the Iaea and nuclear security. My name is John Barrett, and just by way of introduction, my connection with the Iaea goes back to the time between 2009 and 2013 when I was Canada's ambassador to the UN and international organizations in Vienna, which of course includes the International Atomic Energy Agency. So as Canada's representative, just like Ambassador Hulen, we're on the Board of Governors, and because of the great wheel of chairmanship, or chairing the board, it goes through the 8 different regional groupings. It came around to me, so in my last year I chaired the Board of Governors. Since then, I've taken leave from the Foreign Affairs, or Global Affairs Canada is now called, and I'm President and CEO of the Canadian Nuclear Association, which is the industry association, sort of equivalent for those in the US who know the Nuclear Energy Institute, NEI. It's a sort of counterpart to that. Right, so let me offer our thanks to the Wilson Center and to Joseph and Rob Lidwack. My connection with Rob goes back a few years since we first met each other as graduate students, PhD students at the London School of Economics. So we have a long history together, and it's really great to see Rob and, of course, to meet Joe. Right, so on the panel today, we're blessed to have Ambassador Heidi Hulen and Petey Clark and Ambassador Laura Holgate, and they've already choreographed it up to a point, which helps the moderator. Maybe that word is a little too strong, choreography. They've agreed on the speaking order. How about that? So we'll start then, because we're going chronologically, not age-wise, but more of who was first involved in nuclear security in the evolution of the subject matter. How about that? And so we'll start with Pete. Petey Clark was until October 1st the ambassador at large in the Dutch Foreign Ministry, working as special counterterrorism envoy and as the Dutch representative in the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification and in the UN High-Level Group on a Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, FMCT. Previously, Pete served as the chief negotiator in charge of preparations for the Nuclear Security Summit held in The Hague in March 2014. And before then, he served as Dutch ambassador to Jordan, deputy perm rep of Netherlands at the United Nations here in New York, and as human rights ambassador. He was the IAEA Director for External Relations Policy Coordination between 1998 and 2003. So, Pete, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And let me start by thanking also the Wilson Center and Joe and everybody who made this wonderful conference possible. I think 60 years, congratulations are in order. I think we are very fortunate that we've had 5 fine director generals in all that time who led the IAEA through a period with a lot of upheavals in with nuclear power, with nuclear weapons, and I think the agency came always very strongly out of those turbulent periods. Now, yesterday we had a few persons in the panel who were present at the creation. My involvement doesn't go back that far, but I became involved with the agency when the VIC was still brand new, and maybe that's appropriate because nuclear security is certainly more of a Vic thing than a Grand Hotel thing. It came about, it started very slowly, and I want to go through the different periods, different phases of nuclear security. But let me say first that maybe all of you here in this room know what nuclear security means in the IAEA sense of the word, to prevent and respond to malicious acts involving nuclear material. But in the outside world, nuclear security means something else, by and large. It means security having to do with nuclear weapons. So for many people, it's not immediately clear what nuclear security means. On top of that, there are many languages where nuclear security doesn't translate well, where there are no different terms for nuclear safety and nuclear security. In Dutch, for example, in both safety and security, there's the same keyword, veilig. And in German, it's the same thing, the same word, sicher. And of course, the people that are working with the concepts on a regular basis know the difference, but it's very difficult to explain to the outside world what nuclear security is. And even when we organized the Nuclear Security Summit in The Hague, nobody really understood what this conference was about, except maybe half percent of the population. So as I said, nuclear security really had a very slow start, and it went through these different phases under very different names. And maybe it's understandable that in the first phase, where nuclear activities were limited to a large extent to the military realm, that there was no great need for physical protection, but that even remained the case in the first Eisenhower years at the end of the in the 50s and the early 60s. It's true that the term, as you heard yesterday, that the term safeguards was coined, and of course there's a link between safeguards and nuclear security, but especially in that first phase, safeguards was mainly a matter of nuclear material accountancy more than the control dimension that came later. So 4 phases, and the first one is in the 70s. You may remember that the early 70s was a period with quite a lot of terrorist activities, 29 hijackings of airplanes in a couple of years, and moreover, a number of activities had happened in the nuclear realm, incidents, including the loss and probably diversion of more than 100 kilograms high-enriched uranium, and a few other incidents that made it necessary to look at physical protection. And in these early 70s, a number of books appeared, including the ones you see not on the screen. Robert Leachman and Philip Althoff, Preventing Nuclear Theft, and Mason Rilridge and Ted Taylor, Nuclear Theft, Risks and Safeguards. And for the public, these issues of nuclear security, to use an acronym, were brought to the fore in the long series of articles of John McPhee in the New Yorker about the lax nuclear security. The times that plutonium nitrate for 4 or 5 nuclear weapons were driven around the US in flatbed trucks. Now, to be fair, that started to change already in these years, the regulations for protecting nuclear material. And moreover, the United States took a few initiatives to further improve the situation, one being the initiative to have a convention on the physical protection of nuclear material in a speech by Henry Kissinger in 1974 to the General Assembly. And in the same speech, he proposed to create a group of nuclear suppliers, which was a reaction to the Indian explosion, but also was important for physical protection, because one of the guidelines speaks about proper physical protection of nuclear material when you export it. So that was the situation in the early 70s, and the agency in that period was already on the ball. It started with an agency panel in 1969 in Tokyo on safeguards methods and techniques with special reference to inspections. And that panel realized that without a state's physical protection program, the containment and surveillance dimension of safeguards wouldn't work, and it advised that the agency should develop recommendations for physical protection standards. And that's what happened. In typical agency fashion, I should say, an open-ended working group meeting, a consultants meeting, and finally an experts panel in early 1972. Et voila, you had what is later called the Grey Book, the first set of recommendations of the agency, or of an agency panel, one should say, with recommendations for physical protection of nuclear material. And that book, a couple of years later, became INCIRC 225. Right, so that was the first period and the first steps made in the agency. The second stage starts with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the fear that the Soviet Union not only would dissolve as a state, but that the physical security and nuclear security would also dissolve. And indeed, there are many examples of lax security in the Soviet Union. And yesterday already the example was mentioned of the Project Sapphire. I won't go into that now, but it was one example of lax security. And fortunately, it gave rise to a lot of cooperation between especially the US and the Russian Federation. And in the agency, all these incidents having to do with nuclear material led to the setup of new activities to counter the illicit trafficking of nuclear and radioactive materials. And from 1994 on, the General Conference adopted resolutions on illicit trafficking of nuclear material. You still do not find the words nuclear security there, let alone nuclear security architecture, but it is a further step in that evolution. And incidentally, what's interesting is that there was a summit meeting in Moscow on nuclear safety and security, and that's where for the first time you find the words nuclear material security. And then there was 9/11, and Laura yesterday already indicated under what circumstances we, working in the agency, learned about 9/11. I was on my way to go down to the board meeting when we had a television in our corridor and when we saw the planes hit the towers. So just before 9/11, there had been an experts group working for a couple of years to come to recommendations to strengthen the Convention on the Protection of Nuclear Material. And the board took up these recommendations. You can say 9/11 had nothing to do with nuclear material, but it showed the complexity of terrorist activities, and it also showed that the conventional wisdom that especially radioactive material protects itself was no longer true. If people are committed, don't shy away from committing terrorist acts, even if it means that they would die because of it. So that's why Mohammed al-Baradei at the time called it a wake-up call also for the IAEA. And there was a third factor, but we learned about that only sometime later, that in that same summer of 2001, a leading Pakistani scientist having to do with Pakistani Atomic Energy Commission and Kahuta and bomb designs met for a couple of days with Osama bin Laden and Zawahri to discuss, shall we say, nuclear options. So altogether, 9/11 also made quite an impact in the agency. Also, of course, outside of the agency, especially in the G7, with the creation of the Global Partnership of 2002 and the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism in 2006. But the changes were also quite considerable. The Director General set up a few months after 9/11 the Advisory Group on Nuclear Security, ATSEC, and the Secretariat came forward with the first integrated set of proposals to deal with nuclear terrorism. And there were there was a set of different categories, legally binding and non-binding international instruments, international guidelines and recommendations acceptable to the international community, related assessment services, training, equipment and technical advice, and the exchange of information and related services. I was involved to some extent, but most of the work was done by Anita Nielsen and her people in the Office of Nuclear Security that started in the Department of Safeguards and then in that period moved to nuclear safety. And then came the fourth phase in my categorization, the nuclear security summits. I will be brief on that because others will want to speak to that as well. The first question you can ask is, was that an exercise to take away a responsibility from the Iaea? And Laura was already worried that I would say yes to that question, but the answer is clearly no. And I would argue that the NSS process, the series of summits, was very good for the agency. In all the documents, for example, in the The Hague communique, we spoke of the essential responsibility and central role of the agency. The NSS process, of course, also gave more body to technical recommendations that had been created by experts, by committing states to implement these recommendations, a document called INSRC 869, and other gift baskets that were developed in the course of the process. I think the greater awareness among leaders helped also to boost the IAEA budget from about 1 million to 4 or 5 million, the regular budget, not to mention the Nuclear Security Fund. It helped to shorten the time for the implementation of the amended, the entry into force of the amended CPPNM. And it led to all sort of national measures. When leaders come together, they ask their lieutenants, what more can we do? And then the bureaucrats need to think of something. In the Netherlands, for example, we had already reduced high enriched uranium in our research reactor, but we still used high enriched uranium for the targets for making medical isotopes. And I'm happy to report that as of the 1st of January this year, we now have transformed that process to low enriched uranium. And maybe finally, what is important, I think, that the NSS process strengthened the links to academia and industry. Of course, the IAEA has also its industry forum and a number of other mechanisms, but because the NSS is a much more flexible animal, those links were really strengthened because it's important that governments and industry work together very closely in order to improve nuclear security. A few more points. One is that in the NSS, we have talked quite a lot about the link between safety and security. both sets of measures serve, of course, a common purpose, that the public and the environment is protected from radiation, radiological hazards. But I think it's also important to pay attention to the safeguards security interface. As we've seen, physical protection came out originally out of the safeguards thinking, and the other way around, proper nuclear security helps safeguards. And now I know that the agency has had, over the years, by and large, negative experiences when safeguards inspectors try to point out security defects on the site, because states, by and large, don't like that or didn't like that. I think that's short-sighted, and I think more attention should be paid to that interface. Finally, what is the outlook for nuclear security in the agency today? And let me go through the different categories that I mentioned earlier as the categories that ADSAC, the Advisory Committee on Nuclear Security, used for its advice. First, on legally binding international instruments. We have now the amended Convention on Physical Protection. The review conference is still a number of years off, but I think it's very good that the agency in a couple of weeks already organizes its first meeting of member states to see what it is that can be done under this amended convention. Then I think the set of guidelines that the agency has developed over the years is now quite solid, and the main challenge is to implement these recommendations in practice. As I mentioned, this INSTRUC 869, which commits states to implement these recommendations, is quite valid. It was the brainchild of one of my colleagues in the run-up to the Hague summit, a colleague who just died a few months ago. It's a question of implementing that. It's a question of expanding the services that the Iaea has, IPAS and other services, and it's important to have the right persons for these services. So it's also a question of having money for training and for bringing these missions, of organizing these missions. And then I think it's important that the lessons from these missions are shared, that there is enough transparency about the results of these missions. Of course, not operational data about nuclear installations should not be shared, but there's a lot that can be shared as good practices. And I think that's also the way forward for the agency. I think this is not the time for revolutionary changes in this field. During the NSS, some argued for a comprehensive nuclear security convention. I think that's not in the cards. I never believed in that, and especially now that we have the amended CPPNM, there's no traction for that anyway. But I think increasing the number of missions, better sharing the information, that the information about the results of these missions lead to greater, or should lead to greater peer pressure among states. And I think that's the way to go, to make it not legally mandatory, but in practice, make it the norm. And I think you can think of ICAO and its safety audits, that over time it becomes the norm that you have that sort of missions of your nuclear installations from a security perspective. And that's the way to improve nuclear security and to strive for excellence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete. Now I'll turn to Laura, Ambassador Laura Holgate, Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Previously, she served as U.S. Representative to the Vienna office of the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Agency from July 2016 to January 2017. Ambassador Holgate was previously the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction, Terrorism, and Threat Reduction on the National Security Council. She was also the U.S. Sherpa to the Nuclear Security Summits and co-led the effort to advance the President's Global Health Security Agenda. From 2001 to 2009, Ambassador Holgate was the Vice President for Russia and New Independent States programs at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And prior to that, Ambassador Holgate directed the Department of Energy's Office of Fissile Materials Disposition from 1998 to 2001 and was Special Coordinator for Cooperative Threat Reduction at the Department of Defense, where she provided policy oversight of the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. Laura, please.
Thanks so much, John. And following the lead of others, let me just say kudos to the Wilson Center and Los Alamos National Laboratory for bringing together this really amazing group. And it's kind of a shame that the audience is so much in the dark, because that's been one of the really super impressive things about this conversation, is that it's not just the people up here, but everyone who's part of this conversation that brings, at this point, I can say centuries after Dan Poneman's comments yesterday, literally centuries, perhaps a millennia of Iaea expertise in this room, and it's a special treat to be part of that. By many lights, I am a relative newcomer to this. I've really only been working in the Iaea space since the early 2000s. As my bio might suggest, I was focusing a lot more on bilateral efforts prior to that. But it's I've learned a lot over the last few presentations, and so I'm really grateful to help celebrate this landmark in the agency's history. So the way we've divided it is, as Pete hinted, is that I will focus on the nuclear security summits and how they related to the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's much more that could be said about the summits besides how it connects to the agency. So if folks want to get into that in the Q&A, I'm happy to entertain those conversations. But I wanted to focus for this morning on the connection between the summits and the agency's work. The proposal to convene a nuclear security summit was actually part of Senator Obama's campaign platform, which is kind of astonishing to think that someone striving to be president would say that that would be a thing that would attract support and voters. But it really was not much more than an idea. It matured a little bit in the year prior to his election. And at the request of a colleague who's doing some research, I dug up some of my own personal emails from the 2008 campaign, where I was one of a cast of at least a couple hundred of non-proliferation advisors. And there was a memo that proposed that the president give a speech, or the candidate give a speech on nuclear security. And there were a number of outlines for what that might include. And there was a bullet point about a summit in the context of nuclear security. And the initial draft memo that I found in my files mentioned a P5 summit. And then a subsequent draft expanded to say P5 and other interested countries. But the speech, the campaign version of that speech was never ended up being given. And that idea of a summit didn't really mature that much more until after the election. But it was clear that there was really, I couldn't find any evidence that there was thought, and I don't remember the conversations myself, that there was any thought of using an existing multilateral institution to be the platform of that summit. It was clear that it was going to be a standalone thing, but it was also clear that it was seen by the candidate and by those around him that saw the challenge of nuclear terrorism as one that required a broad and international effort. And I will say it's certainly very consistent with the overall policies of President Obama in support of multilateral activities and venues and solutions to global problems. The idea became solidified in April of 2009, the famous speech in Prague, nuclear security being one of the four pillars of the president's nuclear policies. And I was at that time still waiting over at the Nuclear Threat Initiative for my position to get a funding line associated with it at the White House. And so it wasn't until September or really July or August of that year of 2009 that the planning really began in earnest to design what were these summits going to be. And I can say from the get-go, as Pete hinted at, that it was absolutely baked into our whole conception of the nuclear security summits. I called them the 4 E's: energize, elevate, enhance, and empower the existing processes and organizations that were in place in support of nuclear security, and many of them have been mentioned. And what that meant was that the leadership of those organizations would be engaged in the development of the process itself. The other design element that we thought was critical was that there be specific deliverables. We internally called them house gifts as we prepared for that first summit of, you go to a dinner party, you bring a gift for the host, and so this was kind of our little shorthand of what what we were wanting to get. It wasn't just come to a party, and keeping in mind in the fall of 2009 when we were sending out these invitations, when we were planning the summit, Barack Obama was pretty much of a global celebrity, and everybody wanted to be part of something that touched him. And so we said, well, how can we use this celebrity to really move the agenda? And so we wanted to say, look, we're going to have some very specific deliverables that are what we aim for coming out of this summit. In terms of the attendance, by then it was clear that it was going to be more than P5 or even P5 plus small n. By the time I got there, what I'd been told is the president was thinking maybe 25 countries, because he wanted to really have a conversation. He didn't want it to be a series of scripted speeches. He didn't want he didn't want it to be overly structured, and there's some tipping point. I'm sure some multilateral scholar somewhere has done an analysis of it. At what point in the number of people in the room do you go past a conversation and into just recitation of extant positions? And so the thought was 25 countries, but explicitly not like-minded. Knowing that this was going to be less than universal, what we were trying to do is, among those in the room, to create at least voices that represented all of the relevant positions. And so I call this diverse minilateralism, where we were looking for not just geographic diversity. Certainly, we were seeking ideological diversity. We were looking for diversity across countries' experience with nuclear stuff, nuclear weapons, nuclear energy. So countries that had weapons, countries that used to have weapons that don't, countries that people were worried about might get weapons, countries that had given up weapons. And then similarly for energy, countries with large energy programs, small energy programs, no energy programs, hopeful to have energy programs. So looking for positions and points of view that reflected as much diversity as we could, in the theory that if those diverse voices could come together around some consensus viewpoints and even better consensus actions, that would kind of stand in for the universality that we were not going to have in terms of the participation. The other thing that was very clear coming out as part of the design feature was this was going to be a focus on nuclear security, not all of the other nuclear stuff that gets talked about, and explicitly not the 3 pillars of the NPT. The theory was there were places in Geneva, in New York, elsewhere in the NPT review and PRECOM processes where there was plenty of places to aerate those concerns and those issues and so on. And so this was intended to be a summit about how do you keep the bad stuff away from the bad guys, or whatever shorthand you want to put it, and not fall into the canonical debates that we already in the early 2000s were seeing. We're beginning to make it difficult to make progress on those other issues. And so there was a decision explicitly to try to insulate the summit from that set of debates. And I'll come back to the degrees of success for some of these design features, but that's what we were aiming for. And so in terms of the outcomes, as everyone knows, there were 4 summits, first in the United States, then in South Korea, then in the Netherlands, and then back to the United States. Each of those summits generated a consensus communique, and in each of them, the IAEA featured centrally. Pete has made reference to the central coordination role that I think was quoted in all 4 of those communiques and many other documents that are negotiated in Vienna. But also, it was we were looking for a range of member state-led efforts, or looking for the IAEA, or calling on the IAEA to support what member states were choosing to do around HU minimization, radiation source security, nuclear security guidance and training, incident and traffic database, and so on. But there's a much longer litany of all the ways in which the IAEA supports nuclear security activities. And so it was really shining a spotlight on those set of activities. In 2010, there was a work plan, which was a very detailed document that included an entire chapter on the IAEA's role and what member states expected and hoped and themselves intended to contribute to the IAEA's work on nuclear security. In 2016, the final summit, there were 5 action plans that were adopted by consensus for each of the enduring institutions or initiatives that existed that had a part of the nuclear security mission space. So the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Interpol, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, and the Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons and Materials of Mass Destruction. And so one of these action plans, the IAEA action, well, let me just say that the purpose of these action plans was to really try to infuse the summit priorities going forward into those organizations through their normal decision-making processes. We spent a lot of time, frankly, wasted a lot of time saying, the summit is not the boss of the IAEA. So, well, nobody was observing or proposing or suggesting that anyone believed that, but we had to say it time and time again. And what that meant was, I mean, the reality underpinning that was that anything that was going to change about how the IAEA was going to address nuclear security had to be brought forward through normal IAEA procedures of how the member states and the Secretariat interact, through resolutions, through nuclear security plans, through resolutions of the Board of Governors, all of those various things, which we're not going to, leapfrog over those processes, but to recognize that the 50 countries, more or less, who were part of the Nuclear Security Summit were also members of the IAEA. They had a voice. They could work together to support the summit mission space and to gain support from other countries to do so. So the IAEA action plan had a number of chapters, many little bits in it that highlighted things like enhancing the IAEA's role and support of member states on computer security, on nuclear forensics, on nuclear detection, on incident response, on security during transit, on security culture, nuclear security guidance and training development, and a whole range of things that I think we would all recognize as stuff that the IAEA is doing and might do more of and might do better. And so that was an important outcome from the final summit. Putting all the summits together, we had 350 of these national commitments or house gifts that I mentioned. And many of them involved the IAEA, involved member states indicating steps they were going to take in connection with the agency. In some cases, it was providing resources to the agency for nuclear security work, whether cash contributions to the Nuclear Security Fund or people to staff the various advisory missions of the agency on nuclear security, or participation and equipment in support of the IAEA's assistance that they provide to other member states. Many countries added requests for the IPAS missions, International Physical Protection Advisory Services. That went up significantly during the summit's process, including requests from, I think, all three of the countries represented here, as understood to be relatively mature nuclear programs. But one of the things that we explicitly wanted to do from U.S. policy point of view is to kind of break this model where the IPAS mission is the beginning of a conversation about assistance, and therefore only countries that needed help or were going to ask for money or equipment from the agency did an IPAS, or rather it being much more of something that any responsible nuclear country should be doing to check their practices and regulations and organizational structures against what was known to be working and smart and best practice globally. And I think that's been shown to be a significant change in and shift in how the IPAS missions are perceived. Obviously, there were a number of removals of highly enriched uranium from various countries during the summit process, and in many of those cases, the Iaea provided the kind of project coordination and in some cases funding pass-through, sometimes when all of the parties that were involved in some of those complicated shipments were having trouble relating directly to each other. Even though these were national commitments, many of them did contribute to and bolster either the role of the agency or the relationship between member states and the agency. There were also a number of collective commitments which were kind of invented on the second summit, and now the gift basket phrase starts to make a little bit more sense as a collection of house gifts into a single basket. This was meant to be a way to what happened was in the first summit, we looked at all of these house gifts, and there were clearly some themes where different countries were committing to do similar things. And we used some of those themes, the U.S. negotiating team did, as we approached the Seoul summit to say, well, maybe there's enough common perspective that we can bake some of those things into the next communique. And in some cases that was successful, but in many cases not. And it wasn't necessarily a problem that it wasn't, because coming back to the diversity point that I made earlier, the summit was full of countries, and it ended up being 50 countries, not 25, full of countries, each of whom had very different approaches, very different nuclear infrastructure, different materials, different regulatory stuff. And so it wasn't necessarily a way to create a one-size-fits-all for a lot of the specific actions that needed to be done. And so these gift baskets were created as a way to collect a bunch of similar commitments and to observe that, it's meaningful that 5 or 12 or in some cases 30 countries are all doing this stuff. That says something even more than that each of those 30 countries said they were going to do that stuff. And that many of them had connection points to work at the agency. And Pete mentioned, one that was really kind of a breakthrough, which was became known by the catchy phrase of INFCIRC 869. And it started out as being as he mentioned, a brainchild of Bart Dahl, to really trying to say what would it look like if you really did nuclear security well. And we walked around that a few times, and with the Koreans, because it was envisioned as a tripartite thing, the 3 summit hosts working together. And we really couldn't come up with anything that we thought would receive more universal support than the guidance that the agency had already put out. But as was hinted at yesterday, IAEA guidance and guidelines for nuclear security are purely voluntary, purely advisory. Nothing requires anybody to do anything about those advices. And what this idea was saying, those of us who choose to join this, we will commit to take those guidance documents, the 3 basic fundamental guidance documents, and put them into our national regulatory processes by whatever processes each of our unique regulatory things require. And I will tell you, the hardest negotiation I had with that document was not with Pete or with our Korean counterparts or anybody else. It was with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who was very nervous that we were going to be constraining their behavior. But that wasn't a bad thing, because every country was going to have that challenge with their own regulator, because every regulator works a little bit differently. But anyway, to take the spirit of those concepts and put them into regulation, and that way you were voluntarily, yes, taking that guidance, but you were putting it into something that was then permanent and had the power of the state to enforce. Other gift baskets that related to the work of the IAEA were the Centers of Excellence, which suddenly started to pop up as a fun catchphrase for what had already been begun in previous days of the nuclear security support centers that many countries were developing. And so how could those centers work better together, and what could the agency do to help coordinate those? There were gift baskets on radioactive source security, which again was a rising concern within the agency, and guidelines being put on there. So a lot of these gift baskets ended up having very strong connection points to the agency's work. Finally, and as Pete mentioned, the Convention on Physical Protection finally fully came into force with the ratification of the 2005 amendment, and that was the ratification stood at about 20 or 25 countries in 2009, and so we added 80 new ratifiers during the course of the summit on the basis of an enormous amount of political and diplomatic hard work by the U.S., by the Netherlands, almost everyone in this room contributed to moving that. That was just a huge lift. In January of 2016, mind you, the summit was coming up in April. We were giving the president a rundown of where are we on our goals, and he said we're 15 countries away from EIF on the CPPNM amendment. He said, well, that should be doable. Susan, get on the phone, meeting Ambassador Rice, of course. And so of course, that wasn't the first thing you do, is you don't necessarily send the National Security Advisor on the phone to all these countries, but that gave me the power to go sit on my friends at the State Department to say, no, really, we're going to get this done. And you tell us what you need. Let's have plans, let's have cables, let's have demarches, let's find partners, let's do co-demarches. We even did co-demarches with the Russians, not at that time, but an earlier time on the CPPNM stuff. So that was an enormous lift, and without the summits, I am confident that we would not have had that treaty, that convention entered into force today. And just like DG Amano said yesterday about the safety treaty, compliance with these treaties, ratification and implementation of these treaties are part of what underpins public acceptance of nuclear energy in countries. And so as much as it is a choice to join the treaty, as much as there is no enforcement part of the treaty, it still has a valuable role in setting norms and expectations of behavior. So what I would argue is that these outcomes suggest that the summits did much to build up the work of the IAEA in nuclear security, in the awareness of member states regarding their nuclear security responsibilities, and the usage of member states of the resources the IAEA offers them in carrying out these responsibilities. The enduring theme throughout the summits is the IAEA's central coordinating role. And whoever is going to hit the slide, this is the one thing I wanted to put up there. Some of you who've journeyed with me through Sherpa meetings will recognize perhaps a previous version of this. I've done a little updating since I've had a little bit more time to think and exposed it to a few more people. But essentially what this shows is the global nuclear security architecture. All of the portions of the international community that connect to nuclear security. And it's structured, I'm not necessarily expecting everybody to read it, it's more the volume of boxes that I want to communicate here. But it's structured so that at the bottom are things that are the responsibility of states to do. So national regulators and guidance, how the industry interfaces with those regulators. The counter-nuclear smuggling teams that connect the intelligence community with the law enforcement community, with the diplomatic community, and with the technical communities, and so on. Centers of excellence and nuclear security support centers. So those are all things that happen at the state level. The next level up is what I'll call collectives, by which I mean informal groupings, whether regional arrangements, professional societies, establish things like the Global Initiative and the Global Partnership, the Nuclear Security Contact Group, the World Institute for Nuclear Security as an industry collective, the Principles of Conduct for Reactor Vendors, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and here I do want to say thank you to Pete. He was a little bit too modest in reminding us that the NSG does have a nuclear security role, and his role when he was president of the NSG in strengthening that role. The next level up are the formal treaties and international organizations. And so the IAEA is right there at the middle of that and intended to be at the middle of the whole chart. But you also have things like 1540, the Early Notification Convention, Interpol, mutual assistance conventions, and so on. And I've got a box there. The gray boxes mean things that haven't yet been agreed, but that people talk about or that people might think. And so that gray box there is just a placeholder to say, do we have all the formal international stuff that we need? Is there more that's out there? And then the top bar is kind of the aspirational piece. Those are the norms that are in development and are percolating down into some of these formal structures. So we have general consensus around norms of minimizing the use of highly enriched uranium in civil cert purposes, around building confidence measures, around peer review, which IPAS is, kind of a piece of that. And then we have other things that have been proposed but are still nascent and certainly not yet I would call consensus around what is the role of cyber in nuclear security, the non-accumulation of separated plutonium, regular progress reports on how you implement your nuclear security capabilities, technology substitution for technologies that either use dangerous fissile materials or dangerous radioactive materials, and demonstrable competence. And how do you know your people and your organizations are actually competent to do the things that they're supposed to do? So this is just a point that the IAEA, when we say the central coordinating role for the IAEA, that's a big job, and it's a challenging job. And the IAEA routinely convenes information exchange meetings among many of these groupings. Member states have routinely expressed a wish that those meetings contribute to the improved impact and efficiency of the myriad nuclear security efforts here. So having painted the affirmative picture, I will say that the hopes and expectations for many of the summit participants regarding the IAEA's role in nuclear security remain unrealized. And I want to offer several reasons for this, and I suspect that those who've been working on this will have their own, and maybe we can get to that in the conversation. The first, I would say, is based around the challenge of threat perception and the reality that despite what the 50 countries said in each of the communiques from the summits about nuclear terrorism being, the greatest threat, among the greatest threats, whatever, that's clearly not a universally perceived viewpoint. I think they all recognize that was the price of admission to the summit process, and there really wasn't a ton of argument about that text, but there was an enormous underpinning argument about what actually was the threat, how real was it. And so what the U.S. has consistently presented and believed, and we have, this is actually what people know to be true inside the U.S. government based on intelligence and analysis and everything else, is that terrorists have in fact demonstrated the intent to utilize weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, first of all. Secondly, that information about nuclear weapons is available in the public domain. And third, that the securing and reducing the material that could be used in nuclear weapons or radiological weapons that could be used to create these weapons is the best way to prevent a nuclear terrorist attack. I mean, these, for U.S. policymakers and most Western countries, these are axiomatic. They are not universal. And there was a very strong strain of argumentation during the nuclear security summits, including in the negotiations and very much on the sidelines, that goes the other way, that says nuclear weapons in the hands of the weapon states are the biggest danger, not nuclear terrorists. And that suggests that nuclear disarmament will in fact eliminate the risk of nuclear terrorism. These are equally incomprehensible to those who believe that nuclear terrorism is a serious threat. And so we have these two very strong perspectives. And it's hard for me, I confess, to find that the perpetrators of that second set of viewpoints actually believe it, because it is so impossible for me to understand how the first set is not it does not motivate them. So we really have a bit of a dialogue of the deaf, and whether those viewpoints on those differential viewpoints are held sincerely or whether they're held as debating points doesn't really matter. The bottom line is that is blocking progress. Similarly, we have a challenge of sovereignty. And there's one of the other things that people love to say, as if there was some debate about it, that nuclear security is a national responsibility. Well, of course, whose else responsibility was it going to be? But there is enough fear that talking about nuclear security in a collective way threatens that sovereignty, that it's important to some countries to say it and say it and say it and say it again. There is nothing that will ever undermine that essential sovereign responsibility, nor would we want it to, because the state is the basis of power. If you're going to enforce regulations, if you're going to create penalties for smugglers, any of these things, it requires the state power. On the other hand, I, sitting in my country, have a legitimate worry or a legitimate question or a legitimate reason to be assured about the nuclear security behavior of my neighbor, of my ally, of my enemy. And the more countries do to reveal their nuclear security behavior in ways that do not create worse problems, so I'm not talking about total transparency, but the more assurances, this is the vocabulary we started to develop in the summit context, the more I can do that is visible to my neighbor, my ally, my enemy, that shows I am a responsible steward of my nuclear material. I am doing the needful. The more confident everybody is in the nuclear security infrastructure, the architecture that sits there. And so this is another constant tension that continues to this day between sovereignty on one hand and assurances on the other. And the IAEA is caught right in the middle of that. They can be both the contributor to those assurances in ways that Pete was talking about, for example, with IPAS missions, and then the country that's requested the IPAS mission revealing portions of the findings that don't create more security problems. That's an example of the agency contributing to assurances. On the other hand, the agency is not going to be a security inspector. They are not going to create verification procedures for nuclear security. That's simply, there is no evidence that the member states are interested in giving it the kind of power on nuclear security that it has on safeguards. And so this plays out in large and small ways in Vienna every single day. The other challenge that's makes it hard and made it hard during the summit and will continue to make it hard is the disarmament issue and the rising frustration among many in the world, as reflected in most recently in the Nuclear Ban Treaty, for the slow pace of disarmament among those countries that have weapons. And while we certainly designed the summit to try to avoid that debate, we were unsuccessful. We had to spend many hours in some of the most tough negotiating parts of the summit describing how the nuclear security issues related to the three pillars of the NPT. And ultimately, we were unable to ever improve on the language that was formally agreed in the first summit, but we had to argue about it a lot. Until then, and even as you were going into the more substantive parts of it, going back to this difference in what is the actual threat, there were these constant, efforts to bring this disarmament demand, this pent-up frustration into the debates about what should the agency be doing on nuclear security and issues like that. And those are legitimate concerns. I don't in any way want to suggest, certainly under President Obama, there was no U.S. administration that was more committed to making progress on disarmament. In the absence of a partner, there's not that much you can do. And it was very frustrating that to me, as a U.S. policy official, that the true blocker on progress on nuclear disarmament in this particular case and at this particular moment is Russia, has been Russia for the last several years, was not either the target and certainly did not feel any pressure from others, and that it was the summit turned out to be another venue for that. And that is continuing to block progress in Vienna. And I think looking at the nuclear security resolution debate since the summits, you can see it there. Looking at the nuclear security ministerial joint statement that came out, that was a very problematic document, and we were up until 3 in the morning, not debating, should we have more resources for the agency, or should we, create new opportunities for the agency to do work. But what is it going to say about disarmament, which at that point is not particularly relevant for the moment to the agency's work. So that is continuing to be a problem. Fourth challenge is the continuation of this exclusivity problem. We thought when we designed this diverse minilateralism that, as I said, that would create some connectivity to a universal perception by that diversity, but it didn't. And some countries, I think, honestly felt bad about not being part of it. Some countries saw it as an opportunity to, throw yet more darts at the U.S., and here I will highlight Iran and its role in the NAM. For putting that forward, and they they created this narrative that somehow these summits were intended to undermine the formal multilateral institutions where they had a voice and tools and they knew how to work the system. And so that continues to this day, even though the summits are over, even though the contact group was opened to all countries who wish to contribute to nuclear security activities. That I think it's going to take a little bit of time, and I think we definitely underestimated the challenge that would bring. I will say, on the other hand, I can't imagine having achieved some of the outcomes if we had been negotiating the summits in the General Assembly, for example. So there was a cost to that long list of outputs that I mentioned earlier. Another issue that will always come up is budget constraints. As Pete said, it improved from $1 million to $5 million, but that's still $5 million. I mean, that's not a lot. And there is the Nuclear Security Fund, which is a voluntary fund, which rises and falls, comes with strings attached, which doesn't allow you to give 3-year contracts to staff. There's a number of constraints that come with the voluntary nature of that money. And so those debates over the budget are going to be a problem. I think the DG has done his best to create a little bit of space to avoid the pure zero-sum nature by allowing the budget to grow a little bit so he can tell everybody, whether it's the TC advocates or the nuclear energy advocates or the nuclear security advocates or the safeguards advocates, that, the budget's growing, so it's okay for that other thing to get a little bit more because there's going to be more for others as well. But it still vastly understates the contributions the agency could make on nuclear security. Operationally, it's and I feel a little bit bad to say this with these partners here, but they were absolutely not the concern. We have, I think it's fair to say, a disconnect between capitals and Vienna and the Vienna-based diplomats when it comes to bringing the summit into the work of the agency. A lot of the nuclear security expertise tends to be based in capital, and a lot of the awareness of the leaders' commitments did not necessarily translate to the Vienna-based diplomatic corps. Some of us, Raphael, Heidi, others in the room, were part of the summit process, of the Sherpa process, lived and breathed those commitments, knew what that meant in Vienna, but most of the summit countries did not have their Vienna-based diplomatic team, and that team circulates anyway. I mean, even if it was perfect, that changes. And so there's been, I think, a challenge in maintaining an awareness and a commitment to do hard political diplomatic work in Vienna in support of the summits, even by countries who are part of that summit process. And finally, I just have to reference Russia as a spoiler in this process. They were part of the first 3 summits. They distanced themselves from the 4th based on an initial set of views about how the summits would be run, but I think really more of an excuse in the context of the Ukraine invasion, and that created not as much of a problem in the summit itself, and I don't think it took away from the value of the final summit or the import of its statement. There was a lot of wishfulness that Russia would come back, and I will tell you, we made a few quiet things that I'm not going to say in public to really give them a way to say yes, even at the last minute, even though they hadn't participated in the process, and those were rebuffed. But what we have now is a continued importation of the U.S.-Russian conflict into the IAEA, where Russia sees a win for summit stuff to be a win for the US and therefore something to be blocked. This is of a broader piece of Russia's efforts to tear at the authority and capability of the Secretariat across a range of issues, not just the nuclear security stuff. It's also on safeguards and other areas where they're trying to limit the Secretariat's independence and action. So that is also a problem. Let me just make a couple, well, I don't know, how am I doing on time? Okay. I'm sorry, I thought we were trying to build up time. Okay. So I will, I think most of these I've mentioned. I do want to mention the industry civil cooperation as something that can be done better within the agency. So just a few observations about lessons learned. First of all, top-level leadership still matters, even though we had summit fatigue that led all of the leaders to agree that the 2016 summit would be the last. There were a couple leaders who wanted them to continue. But I don't see enthusiasm to restart the process anytime soon. But somehow we need to figure out how leaders and their teams can keep an eye on the commitments made in the summit process and infuse those, move those into their Vienna diplomacy, also in New York and elsewhere. We also talked, as Mark indicated yesterday, there is a limit to what the IAEA can do on this as a leader because they serve the member states. They only do what the member states allow them to do, and they don't, by and large, make judgments about the appropriateness of member state behavior. If it is within what the NPT allows them to do, sure, enrich up to 90% HEU and use it in a research reactor. The IAEA is not going to say different. They're going to help you do that better, perhaps, and safer and more secure, but they're not going to make judgments. So there's a limit to what kind of leadership we can expect from the agency. Expanded leadership has been great, and the summits have allowed that. And through the summit process, we've seen countries such as South Korea, Australia, Morocco, Spain, Lithuania, Jordan, Netherlands, Canada, and several others step up to take on various parts of the nuclear security agenda and to put time and political resources into the specific projects. So we need to continue to identify additional actors to diversify this team regionally, especially if and to the degree the U.S. becomes less visible and potentially less attractive leader on this subject. Let's see, I talked about the North-South divide and the definitions of security. The security of nuclear materials and military programs remains another area where progress is needed. And I think we've proven that organizations with universal memberships are poor vessels for this discussion, but I continue to believe that countries with weapons programs can and should do more to inform non-weapon states about the nature of security applied to their nuclear weapons programs. There's plenty of unilateral behavior to be done here, such as the U.S. carries out, but I've urged that we seek more coordinated ways to provide assurances, perhaps starting with the P3, then spreading to the P5, and then eventually involving all states with weapons. But I do not see the IAEA as the appropriate or constructive venue for this effort. And in general, this points to the next great challenge of nuclear security, which is how do we bake it into the thought process and behavior of those entities who have nuclear security responsibilities. And by here, I don't just mean the government or the regulator. I mean the industries. I mean the universities. I mean the hospitals. I mean the first responders, who to think about how to incentivize good behavior with benefits that are attractive to the operators. As long as nuclear security remains an unpredictable externality to be resisted, it will be fragile. And we need to find ways to make excellent nuclear security behavior part of branding or value proposition. And in conclusion, the ambitions of the nuclear security summits to elevate, enhance, empower, and energize the IAEA's work have been only partially fulfilled. And I hope we can collectively find the motivation for the kind of concrete action that the DG mentioned yesterday to enhance nuclear security, and that we are not doomed to wait for a major nuclear security incident to finally take the steps that we all know now must be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Holgate. And don't get me wrong, when I said not so good, I didn't mean the presentation, of course, which was wonderful. Yeah, it could be misconstrued. I was just thinking in terms of our time constraints and the like. So, but thank you so much for that. And, you know, over the years, I shouldn't be amazed, but I am that talking to our American colleagues and friends, and I'm always picking up a new term of some sort or another. And diverse minilateralism was a new one on me, but I really liked that one. Thank you so much, Laura. That was a great presentation. Now to Ambassador Heidi Hulen. Serves as Canada's permanent representative to the international organizations in Vienna, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, and is Canada's ambassador to Austria and Slovakia. Ambassador Hulen joined Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in 1996. At headquarters, she worked in a variety of assignments, including policy advisor to the foreign minister, deputy director of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, director of Peacebuilding and Human Security Division, director Non-Proliferation Disarmament Division, director general Non-Proliferation and Security Threat Reduction, and most recently as director general International Security Policy. Ambassador Hulen was Canada's sous Sherpa for the 2016 Nuclear Security Summit and served as the inaugural convener of the post-summit Nuclear Security Contact Group, which aims to maintain momentum on implementing the NSS commitments. And overseas, she served as Minister Counselor, Head of Political Section at Canada's permanent mission to the UN in New York, and was Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada to NATO from 2010 to 2013. Ambassador Hulen, please.
Thanks very much. Am I on here? Can people hear me? Okay, good. That CV makes me sound really old. But let me just say, I'm with you, John. I always learn something new from our American colleagues, and I always wanted to know where this gift basket term came from during the summit. I can tell you, when I briefed a new Prime Minister Trudeau, on the 2016 Nuclear Security Summit, I started talking about gift baskets, and his head kind of went to the side. And I tried my best, and finally I said, Prime Minister, they're joint statements. And he said, okay. But it's good to be here. And could I just say thank you to Los Alamos and the Wilson Center for inviting me onto this panel. It's a real honor to be here with two friends and colleagues whose work I admire so much, and to be moderated here by John, whose record as ambassador in Vienna I have the very unenviable task of having to live up to now. And it's also a real privilege, Laura, to have served under your leadership. Really, yeah, really. I'd like to give a big shout out to the U.S. for the leadership that the U.S. has shown and continues to show, I would say, on the issue of nuclear security. This is something for which we all should be extremely grateful. It's shifted the goalposts, not the goalposts, it's shifted the yardstick, I would say, and inspired many to do more and be more in this domain. You have unique capacity, it's irreplaceable. I can't say that enough. When I hear Laura talk in her presentation about being one of a couple of hundred of non-proliferation advisors to a presidential campaign, I think to myself, wow, you're in a different league than all of the rest of us combined, almost in this domain. So I really want to just say how important American leadership continues to be. Canada has really tried to help out in a very modest way to keep this agenda going following the end of the nuclear security summit process by standing up the U.S.-conceived nuclear security contact group, and that's what I want to talk about. I really, you've heard, we've been through the archaeological dig with Pete, and Laura has shown us the design of what came in the nuclear security summit process. I'm going to talk a little bit about the plumbing, and because that's where I can play. And so I'd like to talk about four things in the time that I have, and I think in order to make sure there's time for questions, I think I can telescope down my presentation a little bit, but I want to talk about four things. One is the post-NSS agenda. Second is the Nuclear Security Contact Group as a vehicle for advancing that agenda. Three, a bit of a report card. How are we doing? Although I think I can shorten there because Laura's covered a lot of the points that I would also like to make, and then cast our minds forward to the forward agenda and what do we need to be thinking and doing in the next year or two on this agenda. So the context for the creation of the contact group, of course, was the end of the NSS process. The outcome documents from the NSS process were consensus-based documents negotiated at length, and when I say at length, there's got to be a Congressional Medal of Honor in it for you, Laura, if I may say. And they were negotiated by all members. These documents committed the members of the NSS process to certain principles and certain actions in support of nuclear security globally. And the 5 action plans, as Laura's already discussed, really talked about what needed to happen within the major processes and organizations responsible for nuclear security in order to give meaning and life to those commitments internationally. Domestically, states took on a wide variety of individual commitments. I think I heard you say 350 national commitments. I don't know if that was for the first or second, for all of them. But it gives you a sense of the scale, and that was reductions of HEU and plutonium. It was enhancing physical protection at nuclear facilities, et cetera. In all of these ways, the Nuclear Security Summit process was enormously successful in galvanizing international attention and action, and galvanizing all of us into real action with concrete results. You've heard some of the results of that already. However, as the 2016 summit was looming, there was a very clear realization that there was an inherent risk, and more than a risk, a probability that once we no longer had a summit process, and particularly a summit process led by the United States President to concentrate minds and incentivize commitments, that attention on nuclear security would dissipate, and that follow-up could flounder. So it was very clear that there needed to be some sort of mechanism for maintaining a certain level of high-level attention and momentum to this agenda. The second realization at the end of the Nuclear Security Summit process was that all of these, the gift baskets, the joint statements, the action plans, they had to be translated from the kind of level of principle and observation, which was nonetheless negotiated, into really concrete actions and activities within these organizations and processes. So there was some follow-up work to be done to infuse, to use Laura's word. And then finally, addressing the exclusivity criticism, which Laura's just talked about, I would say it was clear that there was going to be a lot of criticism around this. It's maybe was less obvious here in Washington than elsewhere, but then, it's the United States. You're always a member of everything, and so it's not really the same set of considerations for you, but this idea of an exclusive club is a toxic idea in multilateral settings, and it was really clear that although it was necessary to have a smaller group of states to generate real action on nuclear security in the presidential process, this would nonetheless have to be expanded in the post-NSS process in order for progress to be sustained and deepened in the organizations that counted. So it's against the backdrop of those, I think, 3 real realizations that the contact group was created. It was the brainchild of Laura and her team. U.S. proposed a joint statement on sustaining action in support of global nuclear security architecture. It was a joint statement that was signed on to by 40 members of the Nuclear Security Summit process. And it was that document that really created the contact group. Signing up to the joint statement was the price of entry into the contact group, and subsequently became IMCIRC 899. And I'll come back to that in a second. U.S. approached Canada about serving as convener, which we were more than happy to do. Although I think I agreed to host the first meeting, and I ended up hosting the first year and a bit. But in any case, it was a great pleasure and personal honor for me and my team. The purpose of the contact group was to address the 3 problems that we had realized, that we had become aware of at the end of the NSS process, maintain focus and energy, translate summit commitments into actions, and enlarge participation and engagement in nuclear security beyond the NSS participants. The membership was varied. It was originally open just to those NSS members that signed on to this joint statement. But the very first meeting of the contact group, it was agreed that one of the key objectives should be to enlarge the group beyond the NSS membership. Therefore, we made that joint statement an IMCIRC, and we invited other members to join us by signing on to the IMCIRC. And the reason for that is that the basic commitment and the price of energy had to be that we were willing to collectively promote the outcomes of the NSS process. And that's not necessarily obvious, which is why only 40 members of the NSS process signed on. In addition to the stated objectives, which were very much on the surface, I had a few of my own objectives for this group. I wanted to maintain some high-level attention, yes, but I wanted a forum where we could do some modest strategizing on the nuts and bolts of implementation, or the really, really unsexy work of figuring out how we would present ourselves in particular negotiations. Second, really wanted to see a constituency of states who are willing to speak up and say nuclear security is core business for the Iaea. Third, building linkages to NGO, academic and industry representatives. I'll come back to that. For responsibilizing a wider range of states to own the issue of nuclear security and help drive it. I really was very struck at the end of the NSS process that this could not just be the United States advancing nuclear security. It couldn't just be the hosts of the different summits advancing it. It could certainly not be the Canadian convener acting on her own, because it was me and one other guy who's sitting in this audience. I want to shout out to Brian, who's done so much work to keep the contact group going. It needed to be a much broader range of states. And then finally, wanted to make sure that we had a venue for ensuring that new and emerging challenges to nuclear security could see the light of day. And so we were able to bake most of that into the contact group over the course of the first year. The membership of the group made that set of objectives quite ambitious, actually. The group is extremely varied. I would say that, Canada has many divergences with a number of the members. China is in the group, among others, and we have very well-known disputes with them on some of the key issues. But in any case, I think it's gone quite well. I want to come back to the report card. Since its inception, the contact groups met 5 times, and I have recently transitioned the convenership to the Jordanian Sherpa, who's also their ambassador in Paris, who I know will do a great job taking it forward. So a bit of a look at the report card. I guess I'm supposed to be clicking this somehow. Which is it? The red one?
No.
Is it, okay. Is it this one? Yeah. Okay. So okay. So I think we've done pretty well against the range of objectives that I've just described. I'll talk a little bit about progress in general. Not all of this can be chalked up to the nuclear security contact group, certainly, but just to give a bit of an overview. One, sustaining focus and momentum. I think the contact groups made a real contribution. We've had the 5 meetings. The meetings are held at a reasonably high level. States have identified senior level representatives to this, probably kind of at the assistant secretary level here in Washington. But certainly people who are either in a position to make decisions for their government or influence decisions by their government on the key issues. Second, outreach to key stakeholders, NGOs, academics, and industry. We've really established a practice within this group of having the industry steering group come in and brief. This is now non-controversial, and that was not obvious at the beginning of the contact group's life, so I'm quite pleased about that. Third, I'm particularly pleased with the extent to which leadership has become diffuse on this set of issues. And here, what you have behind me are the 9 kind of key action areas that the contact group has identified for itself. And you see here the states who have agreed to lead on different issues. This is really important. this means that there are other people getting up in the morning trying to think about how we advance some of these issues in concrete terms, and they're writing papers and they're helping to coordinate the rest of us within the group, and I think that's probably going to be the enduring benefit of this group over time. Third, the group has really established that it's going to be a sustainable group. I've transitioned now to the Jordanian. After Jordan, Hungary will be the convener. So this group is going to be around for a while. We've gotten off to a modest start, but it's going to be a factor for the next little while. Fourth, resources. This is not a contact group success, but just to say, generally speaking, we're making modest progress when it comes to resources within the Iaea last year's budget. We got 4 regularized Iaea positions into the Nuclear Security Division, which will help the agency deliver nuclear security-related work on a more sustainable and predictable basis. Nowhere near good enough, but a start. Fifth, the culture of deliverables, and I'm not going through this list, I'm going through my own list here. The culture of deliverables, which has started in the Nuclear Security Summit process, has continued in a modest way. A lot of those joint statements that were passed at the Nuclear Security Summit in 2016 have been turned into IMCIRCs. We've invited others to sign on. Canada, for example, had a joint statement on WINS and certified training, which is one of the key issues, as you know, for dealing with insider threat. Well, it's turned into an IMCIRC. Some non-NSS members have now signed up to that gift basket. And so, I think we're seeing some continuation of that culture of deliverables. Sixth, expanded membership. We've had 5 new members join since the the Nuclear Security Contact Group was created: Colombia, Luxembourg, Philippines, Slovenia, and the EU. And we have another 15 countries who are considering joining. So that's very good. There's another question about how big you want this kind of a group to get. And I'd like to say just one more thing about that in a minute. But in any case, it's a good sign that people are interested. And then, as Laura has already talked about, there's been real progress on some of the practical mechanism, really big uptick on requests for IPAS missions, for example. Notwithstanding progress, we've also had a number of missed opportunities since the NSCG was created and since the end of the summit process. And I would say, in all candor, that I don't think the Nuclear Security Contact Group has yet lived up to its full potential. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. This is partly a function of the group's structure. This is not your average contact group. I've been involved in many in my various multilateral postings, and they've never been this large, this cross-regional, represented this divergent a set of views. And so, there is a balance to be struck between broadening ownership and interest and simply recreating the dynamics which exist within the key organizations. And that's going to be a strategic question for the group going forward. So composition remains both a strength and a weakness. Broader membership and interest, good thing, but it does hamper our ability to do real strategizing as a group. It's also not a decision-making body, so that was one of that was the price of having such broad membership, is that it was very clear that we were not going to be doing forward-leaning work, making statements as a contact group, et cetera. That was never going to happen in this group, so that's also contributed to the missed opportunities. So big missed opportunities are the 2016 Ministerial Declaration. Followed the last summit. Very weak document, in my opinion. The contact group got going too late to impact negotiations on this document in reality, and it's certainly outside the realm of the contact group's remit to reach consensus on negotiating positions, but still, the framing of nuclear security as a potential not threat, but as potentially hampering peaceful uses in that document. Very, very disappointing. I don't even know where to start with that one. Resources, very, very weak approach to resources as well. Second missed opportunity, weak language in the nuclear security plan. This one was adopted just after for 2018-2021. This was adopted at the first Board of Governors meeting at which I attended for Canada. And I have to say that the resources language is so weak, it actually represents a step backwards, in my opinion. So it's certainly not heading in the direction of the kind of predictability and adequate scale of resources that we need for the Iaea to do its work in this domain. Fourth, I would say that coordination amongst points of contact and their Vienna-based representatives, as Laura has already flagged, has been lacking, as has consistent and clear, sustained messaging on the core issues. That's been very difficult to foster. I think we could do a lot better with that. And then finally, I'll just note, I've just said that we don't want a group to be too big because it hampers your ability to strategize and ends up replicating dynamics which exist elsewhere. But it's really striking that only 40 members of the Nss process were able to sign up to a basic commitment to advance the objectives and conclusions of the Nss process, which they themselves had negotiated and agreed to at the level of leaders. And I would say that in some of these negotiations that I've just referred to, and I'm not going to name names, some of the biggest naysayers on core nuclear security objectives were people who were involved in the Nuclear Security Summit process. So then we have a big challenge ahead of us just to get the politics right. Looking ahead, if I could, and I'm going to end here with 8 areas where I think we need to focus our attention going forward. 1, we need to take advantage of opportunities on the horizon. Next week is the CPPNM conference. That's going to be a really important opportunity to move beyond the kind of guns and gates approach to physical protection and really deepen the discussion around how we close gaps and address new threats. Second, the MPT prep comms and RevCons will be important. There will be another ministerial meeting in 2019. We need to really improve our ability to coordinate and advance shared objectives for all of these meetings. Second, myth busting. There are 3 myths in particular that I would really like to vaporize, if I could say. One is this idea that nuclear security is somehow hampering peaceful uses of nuclear technology. Where to begin? Strong nuclear security standards are obviously key to persuading people that the risks associated with the use of nuclear technologies are being managed and being managed adequately. So there's a direct relationship between the ability to promulgate and make use of nuclear technologies and resources and nuclear security. So it's the opposite of the argument that is advanced so often in Vienna. So we've been on this, as have others. I see Raphael, others nodding. Nuclear security is an enabler. It will remain an enabler, but we haven't convinced a good chunk of the world of that. So that's the first myth that I'd like to vaporize. Second myth I'd like to vaporize is that nuclear security and technical cooperation are a zero-sum game. The idea that nuclear security work bleeds attention and resources away from technical cooperation is simply not true, but it is a very pervasive belief in Vienna. 80% of the nuclear security activities of the Iaea continue to be funded voluntarily. That will not change. Some modest resources on the personnel side are really necessary as threshold condition to allow the agency to make use of that voluntary funding and also to respond to the many requests for assistance from some of the states who are objecting most strenuously to nuclear security language and progress. And then finally, the idea that nuclear security is not really a core part of the IAEA's work, that nuclear security is kind of something that you do when the real work is done. This is something that I hadn't really realized before I got to Vienna, but you really feel it in discussions there. But this work is not transitory. It's here to stay. It needs to be resourced accordingly, and that's something that we really need to work on. So that kind of myth-busting role going ahead is what I would say is a strategic level challenge for the nuclear security agenda in the coming years. Third, depoliticizing nuclear security. Politicization, which exists right now for a variety of reasons, is very dangerous. Laura talked about the main reasons, so I won't go into it, but we all know that a single act of nuclear terrorism would change the calculus quite dramatically and quickly when it comes to the use of nuclear technologies and peaceful uses in general. So it's really in nobody's interest to politicize this agenda. The fourth thing I would just say is broadening engagement. I mentioned the industry, and I think Deborah Decker asked yesterday about industry cooperation and how that is being furthered. We've had the industry steering group come talk to the contact group a couple of times, but we're still in the relationship building phase. We really need to turn that relationship now into a series of concrete activities where governments can cooperate with industry to advance the outcomes of the nuclear security agenda. But that requires some more focused thought than what we've been able to do. So I'd like to see, in addition to more countries getting involved in this, a real effort to engage all the relevant partners, including industry and civil society. Identifying and addressing new and emerging threats. I'm not going to say anything about this except that we need to keep looking at what's on the horizon. Fifth, I think I'm at 5, I don't know. Maintaining and advancing the culture of deliverables. We've maintained a bit of this, but we need to do a lot better. And so new concrete commitments can and should be made, but it's a question of trying to figure out how to incentivize them. We don't have a summit process, and we're not going to be able to replace it. Finally, improving resources. Sorry, I only have 2 more points. Improving resources. This remains a particular concern, not only for a number of states and the challenges they face in ensuring that they have nuclear security frameworks in place, but particularly for the IAEA, which relies for over 80% on voluntary funding. And so that percentage is not going to change in the near future, but the number of states who are contributing to this should. And we need to be working with those who can make financial contributions, however modest, to just expand the circle of support to the IAEA for this very important work. And then I had industry. I think I could end there, actually. I've already talked about industry. We need to turn that into a much more concrete set of steps under treated area. I would talk a little bit about the disarmament nexus. I think we can leave it for the Q&A session, though. I am happy to come back to that. And so with that, John, could I just say again, thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk about this, and happy to take questions. C'est tout pour moi.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I think everyone here will agree that it wasn't my job to interrupt any of the speakers, because I just thought, personally speaking, this has been the best single explanation of the history, all the main issues, where we are on nuclear security that I've heard yet. So I think it was just a great treat to have that, and I wouldn't. Yes, and once again to this panel. We were talking about it last night, and I'm stealing this from Heidi. She did say it's a bit like the ghosts of nuclear security, past, present, and future. For those of you who know the Christmas Carol, I wasn't going to use that because that makes me, I guess, Ebenezer. so anyway, no humbug from my side. Right, we have some time for questions. I know a lot of people in this room probably attended in one way or another these nuclear security summits. I attended 2014-16, but at the Nuclear Industry Summit. And the reference that Heidi was making is that at the end of the 16 summit, we also, as an industry group, international industry group, was looking at what do we do after the end of the security process, at the summit process. And Nucleus maintained that connection, and we established and sort of announced it at the December 2016 ministerial conference in Vienna, the Nuclear Industry Steering Group on Security. And we've identified 3 working groups in there, which are essentially cybersecurity. It's always a big, big issue, and it carried over from an earlier discussion. Governance and governance sort of architecture, if you will, and on nuclear security, and certification and training as 3 areas we're working on. I won't go into that in detail, but it is, we've been invited to speak to the contact group, and we're still trying to kind of make that connection with the different action plan organizations as how we as industry can actually facilitate, because we have the operators and the people actually handle a lot of this. Enough from me, over to the audience now. I'll take questions in groups of 3. If that's okay, we'll start with one question here, and then Mark, okay? So please, I'm sorry if I don't, please introduce yourself so for the record on the recording. So there's a microphone coming over here.
Thank you. Well, I want to address the big elephant in the room, which is the Trump presidency. And I want really to ask questions, kind of 3-folded questions. We're talking about presidency that on one hand intends to enhance its nuclear weapons posture, about a presidency that looks very badly about multilateral arrangements, America first, and about presidency that put down very much the State Department. As you know, it proposed a cut of possibly up to 30% of its budget. So the question to all of us, and obviously Laura is the fully independent person, she's now a free agent, so to speak, at Harvard. How much damage could be happened to the achievements that were described here, given what we have now?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Paul Schultz from Birmingham University. Following up Avner's elephant, if American energy and money has been vital in trying to reorder and hold together and hold off the entropy of nuclear security, and if that is now going to be at least toned down and maybe absent, what can be done, if anything, to substitute for it effectively? Just beyond the contact groups and the conversations of diplomats, splendid though you all are, what are the chances of actually achieving at least the level of nuclear security we've got? And where is it most likely to go wrong? In terms of Laura's sprawling architecture, which of those cells is likely to go bad or radioactive first? And what could be done about that, if anything?
Thank you very much. And Mark, I think you're next.
Yeah, Mark Hibbs, Carnegie Endowment. What happens if there is a severe nuclear security event to the agency? Let's just imagine for a minute that we have such an event. It would be nuclear security equivalent of essentially a severe accident in a nuclear power plant. And you have nuclear material involved that is stolen or diverted. You have fatalities, and you have a military response to end the event. I have 2 questions. What would be the IAEA's role during such an event, during such a crisis? What would the agency be tasked to do? And is the agency prepared to do that? And then the second question is, after the event, what would be the impact of that event on the agency's role in the regime? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Some big questions there. That's I'll do the first group of 3 and then come back around to others. Okay. So anyone would like to take a first stab? Does it kind of combine the first two maybe into the question of if leadership of the U.S. does dwindle on this particular subject, what's the impact?
I'll let Heidi off the hook. I'll let Heidi off the hook. So there's actually something, some room for hope in terms of this administration's approach to nuclear security. How many of you were at the the Carnegie conference in March? And you heard there Chris Ford responding to a number of valiant questions from Bob Einhorn, trying to get him to say meaningful things about this administration's nuclear policy. And on every question except one, he essentially punted. Still under review, not yet decision. What was the one thing he was affirmative about? The nuclear security summits were a good thing, and we will be continuing that work. That's the only thing in March that he could say definitively. I took a great comfort from that. This administration has just relooked their approach on nuclear security, nuclear material security, and I don't want to undermine it by saying that it's a lot like it used to be, but it's a lot like it used to be. Perfectly good wines and perhaps shiny new bottles. That's fine, and we should be happy about that. The other thing to note is that the primary resources, this is combining a little bit the questions, the primary U.S. resources for nuclear security cooperation globally are not in the State Department. They're in the National Nuclear Security Administration. And while that funding did decline during the Obama administration, to my great dismay and sadness, it has kind of leveled off with this first Trump budget. And so there's certainly some winners and losers within there. There's a lot of internal politics having to do with the future of plutonium disposition and the large resources that will require, kind of distorting the other work there. But I don't think that we should take as axiomatic that U.S. funding is going to fall off a cliff. It needs to be watched. Every year it needs to be watched, and Congress needs to be reminded to protect it. But I think that we are really moving out of the assistance mode of nuclear security and into the everybody does what they're supposed to gosh darn do. It's there in treaties, it's there in 1540, it's there in, there's resources to help, but it's clear, that's the flip side of the coin about it's a national responsibility, it's sovereign responsibility. Well, yeah, it is, so do it already. And so how do you create opportunities to get that uptake, get that demand pull from countries who do need work? So that's where I see the potential downside, is to the degree that this Trump administration is perceived as not being responsive to broader issues that other countries care about, they are going to care about less about things that we care about. And so the mood music, perhaps a step away from a full-throated commitment to disarmament, perhaps new uses for nuclear weapons and an expanded stockpile, disdain for multilateral institutions. If those are manifested in policy over time, that will diminish the U.S. as an attractive partner. And if the U.S. is absent from these multilateral institutions, I think that those institutions are the poorer. So I think it's not a direct connection, but I think it creates a much different and perhaps problematic atmosphere for that.
Thank you very much. Anyone else on that? Or maybe, Heidi, I was going to pitch to you the one about if any of those areas up there may go sideways, what would it be? You might consider that one as well.
Abuse the floor to say that I actually don't think that the elephant in the room is the Trump administration on this, for exactly the reason Laura said. It's one of the areas of genuine continuity between administrations, and also the U.S. is not the only P5 member that's engaged in a program of nuclear modernization. So that's observe that. The real elephant is the slowdown in disarmament progress and the effect that this is having on the other pillars, of the MPT and work in those areas, and we can come back to that if we can. I would, on this last question, Mark's question about what happens in the event of a nuclear security event, big or small, but significant, let's just say a significant event with deaths and economic damage, et cetera. I don't know the answer to what would the IAEA be tasked to do. Maybe Pete has an answer on that, but I think it's almost certain that the impact of that would be a major new line of work for the IAEA in promoting and advancing nuclear security in a very, very coordinated way. You know, the IAEA should arguably be doing this now. It's not the subject of consensus, but this would have a transformative effect, I think, on that kind of debate that we're having there.
Yeah, Pete.
The US, in this series of summits, has given a huge push to the importance of nuclear security. And after the last summit, it has responsibilities have gone back, or the agendas now are with the proper institutions, in particular the IAEA. And there, as we have heard from both Laura and Heidi, the work continues with all its up and downs. A big nuclear incident would no doubt have a huge impact on how in Vienna the work continues. Fortunately, we haven't had incidents in recent years or news about threats or of course, we have had in the chemical area with ISIS, we've had a lot of terrorist use of weapons of mass destruction, but fortunately, in the nuclear realm, it's slightly better. Now, what would happen if there was a major incident with nuclear material from a power plant? Or, of course, it depends on what that material would be and how much. And given the fact that it's essentially a national responsibility, and even more so, if I can say that, than when it would be a nuclear safety incident, much what you can expect is the IAEA offering particular expertise or sending teams, or compare it with Fukushima or Chernobyl. It would be a role of assistance, offering expertise, mobilizing teams of people, and indeed helping to define and put the problem in a proper context. Making information available to the extent necessary. So anyway, that's the scope of how I picture the assistance, and then depending on how the incident develops, it will have quite an impact on the scene in Vienna of how important this is as part of the overall portfolio.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Ambassador Grossi's mentioning the emergency center that's at the IAEA and other instruments. Now we're pushing up against our time. I'm going to take maybe two very quick questions and then invite everyone to pursue our panelists over coffee. Don't let them get away on you. But Pierre there and Trevor. Thanks. I think, and okay, yes. Yeah, Martin. But the briefer we are, we can get through them and not interfere with the coffee.
Okay. Well, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, I think the choreography was perfect between the three speakers, and I think there was so much consensus among them that I feel that for the sake of discussion, I need to be a little provocative in my questions. Very friendly, but provocative. Pete, you mentioned that you were proud that since January of this year, in the Netherlands, you are not using any more small grams of HEU as targets to produce medical isotopes. Now, I wonder why you are proud of that. Do you consider that those small targets of HEU under IAEA safeguards constitute a security or a non-proliferation risk? And do you think that this is more important rather than placing the huge Urenco enrichment facilities under irreversible safeguards? So to Laura also, I mean, I understand that the US is putting a lot of pressure on countries like the Netherlands to give up their small quantities of HEU under Iaea safeguards. Why, in your mind, is this more important than the US placing some tons of plutonium that are no longer necessary for military purposes under Iaea safeguards? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to Trevor and then to Marty.
Thanks very much, John. I agree this has been a terrific panel. Could I ask about Russia, which I guess is the other elephant in the room? Are the Russians opposing improvements to nuclear security at the declaratory and strategic level, whereas on the other hand, maybe at the working level, they're still participating in training and IPAS missions? I wonder whether they're trying to make a distinction there between those two levels, or is it much worse than I fear? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. And over to Marty for the last.
Martin Mallon from the Balfour Center. Also, thanks to the panel. It was terrific. I wanted to ask how the panelists would characterize the threat of nuclear terrorism today. Is the threat increasing or decreasing? Where are the major vulnerabilities as you look out at the world? And how have the activities of the contact group and other IAEA-related activities mapped onto your assessments personally of the threat and vulnerabilities?
Great. Thanks very much. In any particular order? Who would like to go first?
Well, Pierre started with me.
Yes,
so,
okay. Pete, you're on the spot.
No, these small quantities of HEU in the larger scheme of things are not important. But it's part of an overall drive that I support of minimizing the use of HEU. And this is small quantities, but it's part of this broader movement that is a movement in the right direction. You mentioned plutonium, and I think that's very important. For a number of reasons, the nuclear security summits haven't been able to address the further accumulation of plutonium, and I think from a perspective of nuclear terrorism, that is an urgent problem that the summits have not addressed. So I think the small step that I mentioned, because it's now a topical issue, and I mentioned it also against the background of some rather hysterical comments in the American press at the time of the The Hague summit that, the Netherlands, the organizer of the summit, was still using HEU and this was horrible. And we gave interviews against those alarmist views. And I just wanted to say we've done it now, and that's good, but it's a small step, and it pales into significance with the plutonium issue.
Thank you. I think, Laura, there was a question directed to you.
Yeah, as Pierre well knows, the U.S. had in the past put military origin highly enriched uranium under IAEA safeguards. That material was subsequently downblended and eliminated, so there's no more material under safeguards under that theory. The bulk of the rest of the material that's coming out of weapons has been grabbed by the Navy, and so that's not going to be available for safeguards, and it's going to remain in the military realm, if not in the weapons realm. What you may not have noticed under the cultures of deliverables that Heidi pointed out, that Secretary Moniz announced in December that the 34 tons of plutonium that the United States has declared excess and is in the process of eliminating, even if Russia isn't implementing its roles under that agreement, that we have invited the IAEA to provide verification of that elimination process on a bilateral basis, even if Russia isn't part of it. And so while that's not exactly safeguards, I think it does contribute to the overall sense that this is a legitimate thing to be done. And I have no indication that the Trump administration is revisiting that question. Frankly, there are bigger questions having to do with the fate of our 34 tons of plutonium that we won't get into here.
Did you want to address Russia too?
I actually won't, because it's I don't have that much visibility at the working level, which maybe it speaks for itself. I mean, certainly in the bilateral context, there is almost no meaningful contact between U.S. and Russians at the working level. And we have seen the lies about their views on the nuclear security summits perpetrated at the Putin level. So there's really, I really don't see a distinction between high level and low level in terms of action. We do know that we perceive that the people that we used to work with on a working level still want to work with their American counterparts, but they're not being allowed to within the Russian system. And I'll just say on the threat thing, ISIS having chemical weapons should strike fear in the heart of anyone who worries about this. A radiological dirty bomb is even easier than making your own mustard. I can't believe we haven't had an event already. And I think the kind of motivations that lead to a mustard attack could similarly, from a concept of operations, be applied to a radiological weapon. So I think it's the biggest vulnerability is where there's the most complacency. And that's what I really worry about as the summits revert to some new plateau of normal on the action side.
Thank you. I'll give the last word to Ambassador Hoolan.
Well, just to say that at the Iaea, the narratives that I discussed, this is in response to the Russia question, have kind of taken on a bit of a life of their own. And so no one state, whether it's Russia or others, has to really lead that charge. So the ownership of the nuclear security agenda is diffuse, but so is opposition to it. And that's why the narratives are really so important to counter with facts and energy. On the threat increasing or decreasing, I wouldn't be willing to submit a view on whether it's increasing or decreasing, but it's extremely broad, this threat, and we know that access to information about nuclear devices on the increase online, the intent of the various malign actors and what we know about the intent of the malign actors, coupled with access to the materials themselves, makes this a really scary threat. How does the contact groups work map onto that? I'd have to give some thought to that, but just three areas which are obvious to me is one is it's really important to have a group that thinks of itself as having a role in thinking about nuclear security going forward, because nowhere else in the IAEA does that happen. So the very existence of the group is good. In an urgent situation, that group I think would have quite an interesting informal role to play. Second, the resources. We're banging on about resources for a reason. The IAEA needs to be in a position to do what it needs to do when it needs to do it, and most of all, the IAEA needs to be able to prepare for uncertainty. And so the resources work that we're doing is really hugely important. And then finally, just making sure that we have focus on emerging threats. So that there's somewhere to talk about this. That's something important. I think that the contact group can offer to that agenda as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Right. Well, my thanks on behalf of everyone here to the panel for just wonderful presentations and discussion.